No one noticed the elderly man at first, as he shuffled with deliberate care through the packed crowd on Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., just before the start of the National Veterans Day ceremony. His military overcoat, slightly too large now for his diminished frame, brushed quietly against the legs of onlookers gathered for speeches and flyovers. The ivory-handled cane he leaned on struck the pavement with the same cadence he'd once used to call time in combat drills. He stopped near the barricade by the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool, where tourists took selfies and children waved miniature flags, unaware that the quiet figure standing alone beneath the autumn sun had walked this path once before, long ago, as a young soldier returning from war. His cap was plain, with no embroidery announcing rank or division, and his shoes were polished but cracked from age. His gaze drifted across the marble steps and into the sky, where fighter jets would soon paint arcs of thunder in tribute. But his mind was not on flyovers or speeches. It was on faces long gone, brothers who had laughed with him in foxholes and bled beside him in the mud. A teenage boy next to him glanced over, noticing the rows of campaign ribbons on the man's chest. He nudged his father, who offered a quick smile and nod, but said nothing. A family in matching patriotic shirts shifted closer, blocking the man's view. He stepped back, yielding with a sigh. A gust of wind caught the hem of his coat, and for a moment it flared open, revealing an old, faded patch. A snarling black panther crouched atop a tank tread. No one in the crowd recognized it. Yet it was that patch, the emblem of a forgotten battalion, that marked him as more than just another aging veteran. It marked him as a living chapter of history, unnoticed, but not gone. His name was Elias Booker. He was 98, a former U.S. Army first sergeant who had served with distinction in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Time had reduced his stride and grayed his hair, but in his prime, Elias had moved with the assured steps of a man who knew how to command. He had learned discipline and duty from the sharp bark of sergeants at Fort Knox and the chaos of battlefield orders shouted over gunfire. In 1942, Elias lied about his age to enlist. He was 17, eager, and defiant. The war effort needed men, but only certain men, those of the right color, class, and pedigree, were deemed fit for the most coveted positions. Black soldiers were often relegated to supply units, stevedore details, or construction. But Elias, stubborn even then, refused to be boxed in. When the 761st Tank Battalion was formed, one of the first black armored units in U.S. history, he fought to join it. He was accepted after passing tank school with top scores, where he earned a reputation for his cool under pressure and tactical thinking. The 761st deployed to Europe in 1944, attached to General Patton's Third Army. Patton himself had inspected the battalion and, despite initial skepticism, recognized their value. "I don't care what color you are," he said famously, "as long as you go up there and kill those Krauts." Elias remembered those words, not with fondness, but with the weight of conditional approval. It wasn't trust, it was utility. In France, then Belgium, then Germany, the 761st fought through snow, mud, and ambushes. They were there in the Battle of the Bulge, in the liberation of Gunskirchen-Lager, a subcamp of Mauthausen. Elias lost friends in nearly every town they advanced through. He watched tanks burn with men still inside. He pulled wounded soldiers from shell holes and carried last letters for those who couldn't speak. He remembered one name above all, Carter Moss, his best friend since boot camp. Carter had a crooked smile and always snuck extra coffee packets from rations. In the Ardennes, a German anti-tank gun struck their Sherman. Elias survived, Carter didn't. For years, Elias blamed himself for allowing the platoon to push forward too far that morning. He would wake in cold sweats, the smell of scorched metal and frozen blood still clinging to his senses. After Germany's surrender, there were no victory parades for the 761st. No confetti. No triumphant welcomes home. Elias returned to Baltimore in his uniform, medals carefully folded in his duffel. A diner turned him away. The clerk at the bus terminal pretended not to hear his request for directions. Even the city's American Legion post asked for verification that he had served. So he put the medals in a drawer and took a job cleaning offices at night. Eventually, he got work at a shipyard. He married once, briefly. His wife left after their infant daughter died of pneumonia, and Elias never remarried. Instead, he poured his energy into his neighborhood, fixing up old rowhouses and volunteering at the youth center down on Charles Street. When the Korean War broke out, Elias re-enlisted. He didn't have to, he could have stayed behind. But he felt drawn again to service, if not for the country, then for the men beside him. In Korea, he was promoted to first sergeant and became known for his even-handed leadership. His troops, both black and white by then, trusted him. He de-escalated fights, taught rookies to shoot straight, and never once asked a soldier to do something he wouldn't do himself. By Vietnam, he was in his 40s and graying at the temples. He served in logistics support for a forward artillery unit but still visited the front lines. He escorted medevacs. Helped load body bags. Sent letters home for boys who wouldn't make it back. By the time he retired in 1972, he had logged over 3 decades in uniform, 3 wars, and countless memories sealed tight behind the calm lines of his face. Yet even with the Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star with a V for Valor, and more campaign ribbons than he could count, he remained largely invisible. At VA hospitals, younger clerks would glance at his ID and say, "You sure you served in all that?" He never argued. He simply nodded. History forgot Elias Booker, not because he wasn't great, but because his greatness came wrapped in skin America wasn't ready to celebrate. He bore it all with quiet strength. His stories, like those of so many black soldiers, lived only in fragments, fading photographs, whispered anecdotes, a few lines in obscure military journals. But he remembered. Every name. Every face. Every loss. And every November 11th, he returned to D.C., stood near the memorial, and waited. Not for recognition. Not for praise. But because his silence was a stand-in for those who had none. The men who'd bled in foreign mud and returned to segregation. The heroes who'd never gotten medals. The boys who died before they were even old enough to vote. He came for them. After his retirement, Elias Booker settled in Baltimore's McCullough Homes neighborhood, a red-bricked complex where the paint chipped from railings and fire escapes groaned in the winter cold. The world moved on without much notice of men like him. Politicians gave speeches about valor, movies dramatized heroism. But in real life, valor was often faceless. Elias preferred it that way, at least outwardly. His days settled into quiet routines. He rose before dawn, pressed his slacks with the same precision he'd applied to uniforms, and walked 2 miles to the youth center. There, he taught basic carpentry, helped with homework, and occasionally broke up scuffles with a mere glance. The kids called him Sarge. He never told them much about his service, only that he'd been around long enough to see where anger gets you. His presence was a steadying force, especially for the boys with empty homes and heavier hearts. When his arthritis flared, he still showed up, cane in hand. When one boy brought a switchblade to class, Elias calmly took it from his hand, folded it, and said, "You want to be brave, son? Try showing up tomorrow." The boy did, and never carried the blade again. But outside those walls, injustice continued to press in like damp fog. In 1983, his name was submitted to the city's annual Veterans Registry for a recognition ceremony at City Hall. Elias had not asked to be included, but a former student, now a police officer, put his name in, certain it would be accepted. When the final program was printed, Elias's name was missing. At the ceremony, he sat quietly in the back row while speeches praised sacrifice and freedom. Photographers took pictures of white veterans receiving plaques. No one noticed the elderly black man in the pressed coat with the crooked left shoulder seam. The officer who nominated him approached the organizers afterward. Their response was procedural, clerical error, maybe lost paperwork. They would look into it. But they never did. Elias said nothing. That night, he folded the program brochure and slipped it into the same drawer where his medals had been collecting dust for decades. 2 years later, he attended a local Veterans Day parade. A school marching band played Sousa as floats passed by. A speaker stood atop a decorated fire truck and spoke passionately about the bravery of World War II tank battalions, except he named the 10th Armored Division, attributing their victories to the wrong unit entirely. Elias knew the truth. He had been there. He remembered the 761 Estes path, how they'd crossed the Moselle under fire, cleared German machine gun nests in Tillet, and helped liberate concentration camps. None of that was mentioned. And still, he said nothing. In the 1990s, when the internet became more accessible, Elias noticed a few glimmers of recognition. A military archive site posted a brief article on the 761st. He printed it, framed it, and hung it in his hallway. When younger veterans emailed the article to him, he replied with a polite "thank you." He never corrected them when they assumed he'd only served in Vietnam. He began wearing his old uniform jacket each Veterans Day, walking down to the inner harbor, where ceremonies were now held. People saw the jacket but not the man. More than once, he overheard comments, "He must have gotten that at Goodwill. Probably just playing soldier." Elias would nod politely, keep walking. His cane tapped a steady beat on the pavement. One year, a group of high school ROTC cadets laughed as he passed. They didn't recognize the patch on his chest, the Black Panther poised for attack. One cadet even pointed and whispered, "What's that supposed to be?" Their instructor said nothing. In 2008, an event coordinator invited him to a veterans roundtable at the community college. He agreed. He sat beside 2 Gulf War veterans and 1 Vietnam-era pilot. When it was his turn to speak, the moderator skipped over him by mistake. Later, she apologized profusely. "I didn't see your name on the list," she said. "It's all right," Elias replied. But it wasn't. The erasure wasn't loud, it came in bits and pieces. A program line omitted here, a misattributed citation there. No graffiti or protests. Just silence. The kind that erodes memory and dulls legacy. And still, he showed up. Each Veterans Day, he donned the jacket, adjusted the medals, and took his place, never at the front, never on stage, but always near. Always watching. Always waiting. Not for recognition. Not for apology. But to bear witness. In 2015, a young journalist doing a story on aging veterans came to the youth center. She asked to speak with Elias, having heard from someone that he'd served in 3 wars. He gave her an hour. She asked about combat, about the racism he'd faced, about whether he thought the country had changed. He spoke softly, always with measured pauses. At the end, she asked why he kept attending ceremonies where he was ignored. Elias looked out the window toward a cracked basketball court where 2 boys practiced free throws. "Some of us got written out," he said. "But I show up because they didn't make it back. I carry what they left behind." She published the article. A few readers shared it online. But the story faded in the wash of viral trends and political noise. Elias didn't mind. He hadn't expected much. The next year, the youth center was closed for renovation. Elias no longer had a place to volunteer. His knees stiffened more with each winter. His hands trembled when buttoning his jacket. Still, each November, he made his way to Washington, D.C. He never brought a sign. Never raised his voice. But with each year, the silence around him grew heavier, not lighter. Like a snowstorm without wind, just falling, blanketing, erasing. This year was different. The air felt the same, crisp, tinged with burnt leaves and jet fuel, but something shifted beneath the surface, imperceptible at first. Elias arrived earlier than usual, catching the first metro train from Baltimore, walking the mall with hours to spare. He paused beside the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, running a hand across the black stone, not searching for a specific name, just letting the cold marble remind him of things only silence understood. By the time he reached the reflecting pool, crowds were beginning to thicken. Ceremonial personnel moved in formation near the barricades. Volunteers handed out small flags. Vendors sold commemorative pins and hot cider. A brass band tuned instruments in the distance, the first notes of a Sousa march echoing faintly down the mall. Elias found his usual spot, halfway down the southern edge, by a lamppost that cast a long shadow across the sidewalk. He leaned on his cane, breath visible in the morning air, his coat collar turned up against the wind. No one spoke to him. Tourists posed for pictures with the monuments, children in star-spangled hats ran in circles, and officers barked final instructions to their formations. And then someone noticed. Lieutenant Ava Reynolds, freshly minted from West Point and leading her first ceremonial detail, had been reviewing her assignment one last time. Her eyes swept across the crowd with professional detachment until she saw something that made her stop. The insignia on the old man's coat, an embroidered panther, claws extended, mouth open in a silent roar, was unmistakable. She had written her senior thesis on the 761st Tank Battalion. She had pored over every scrap of documentation she could find, read declassified reports, dug through grainy photographs and faded after-action memos. She knew how rare it was to encounter one of them in person. Breaking from her post, a breach of protocol that under other circumstances might have earned her a reprimand, she walked straight toward him. The crowd parted slowly as she moved, puzzled by her urgency. Elias didn't look up until her boots stopped inches from his. She saluted. Crisp. Flawless. "First Sergeant," she said. "I've read about your unit." He blinked, surprised. It had been decades since anyone addressed him by rank. "You have?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Yes, sir." "The 761st. The Black Panthers. You served in Europe. I read your battalion helped liberate Gunskirchen. And Tillet. Anne." He held up one gloved hand gently, silencing her. "They did," he said. "They did." Nearby cadets and junior officers had started to take notice. A few stepped closer, curious. Ava turned, motioning them over with a single nod. Within moments, 6 of them, 4 men, 2 women, joined her. Then more. A ripple moved through the ranks. Word spread like an invisible signal, "He's one of them." There was no announcement. No orders. But the young service members began forming a loose semicircle around Elias, facing him, at attention. Not as superiors. Not as subordinates. As students. As witnesses. It was silent, but not empty. A few tourists looked over, unsure what was happening. A child asked his mother why the soldiers had stopped. She didn't answer, just took a photo, not knowing why she suddenly felt like she should. One cadet, barely 20, stepped forward. "Sir," she said, "may I shake your hand?" Elias hesitated. Then, slowly, he extended it. She took it gently, as though afraid she might damage something sacred. Behind them, the ceremony's announcer called for final preparations. But the script shifted. A middle-aged program official in a navy blue windbreaker noticed the gathering. Curious, then alarmed, he hustled over. His radio crackled with logistical updates, but his focus locked on the growing crowd around the old veteran. He leaned toward Ava. "Lieutenant, what's going on here?" She answered without turning. "We have a member of the 761st here, sir." His brow furrowed. "A what?" "The 761st Tank Battalion." World War II. First Sergeant Elias Booker. The man stared at Elias, confusion fading into recognition. Oh, my God. He walked briskly to the MC near the podium, whispering urgently. The MC looked skeptical, then startled, then nodded. He paused mid-sentence during a welcome speech, cleared his throat, and adjusted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, we are honored today by a guest whose presence humbles us all. Please direct your attention to the south end of the reflecting pool. Among us is a living chapter of our nation's history. Every head turned. Cameras pivoted. Whispers surged like wind through dry grass. Elias stood perfectly still. I'm not here to be honored, he said under his breath, as the MC motioned for him to step forward. But Ava turned to him, eyes steady. Sir, we carry what you began. You may not want it, but it's time. He didn't reply. But when she and two other soldiers gently offered their arms, he accepted. Slowly, deliberately, he moved forward. The crowd parted. Some clapped. Others stood silently, hands over hearts. Veterans from other wars saluted. Children watched, wide-eyed. And Elias Booker, who had once been told to leave by a parade marshal in Georgia, who had marched in formation only to be forgotten when the banners were printed, walked at the center of the National Mall, surrounded by uniforms decades younger than his own. Not as a relic. Not as a novelty. But as a soldier, at last seen. The moment the army band shifted position to accommodate the pause in the program, the tone of the entire event changed. It wasn't audible, not in the way applause or a brass crescendo might be, but it moved through the crowd like a current, low, respectful, dense with awareness. Something had shifted. This wasn't in the brochure. This hadn't been scheduled. And yet, suddenly, everything else felt peripheral. Elias walked slowly, flanked by Lieutenant Reynolds on one side and a young corporal on the other. He didn't meet the eyes of the crowd, but he sensed their gaze, soft, reverent, full of questions unspoken and histories unknown. Each step he took echoed faintly off the granite and water, as though even the monuments had gone quiet to listen. They led him toward the front, past neatly arranged rows of chairs where dignitaries sat beneath navy blue tents. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs, seated beside a congresswoman from Michigan, leaned in to the MC and asked, "Is that who I think it is?" She didn't wait for an answer. She stood. One by one, others followed. By the time Elias reached the small stage, the entire front section of the audience, retired generals, active duty commanders, foreign military attaches, was on its feet. The applause began gently, hesitant, but it grew. Not wild. Not performative. But long. Sustained. The kind that made people rise before they realized they'd done it. A spare mic stood off to the side, intended for youth essay winners and veteran guest speakers. The MC motioned toward it. "First Sergeant Booker," he said. "Would you like to say a few words?" Elias shook his head. "I'm not here to be honored," he said again, softly. The MC nodded, prepared to move on, but Ava stepped forward and addressed the crowd directly. "Permission to speak out of turn," she said. The MC hesitated. Then nodded. "I met First Sergeant Booker less than 15 minutes ago," she said, voice clear and resolute. "But I've spent years studying his unit. The 761st was among the first black armored battalions in our history. They trained harder, fought longer, and received fewer accolades than any unit I've studied. Their motto was, 'Come out fighting,' and they did. But they came home to silence." She turned slightly to face Elias. "Sir, whether or not you came here to be honored, I hope you'll allow us the chance to carry what you and your men never asked for, but always deserved." Elias stood without moving for a long moment. Then he turned to Ava. "You know their names?" "Yes, sir. As many as I could find." He glanced back at the audience. Then that's enough. The MC, uncertain whether to continue with the program, made a decision. He stepped back from the mic. The band conductor, catching the cue, lifted his baton. What followed wasn't on any agenda. The band began playing "Lift Every Voice and Sing." At first, only a few people recognized it. Some in the crowd hesitated. Others sang softly. But as the verses progressed, more joined. And Elias, standing beside a generation of soldiers that looked nothing like those he'd once commanded, but wore the same uniform, stood taller. Not entirely straight, but taller. As the song ended, the applause rose again. A different kind of sound this time. One that didn't ask for anything. One that gave. Later, after the ceremony resumed and concluded, reporters lingered. Cameras pointed subtly in Elias's direction. He declined every interview. A staffer from the secretary's office approached with a business card and an invitation to an upcoming Department of Defense event. "Sir," she said, "we'd be honored to have you attend a commemorative gala next month." Elias took the card but said nothing. Another young soldier approached, holding a framed citation. "This is a letter of official recognition," he said, "signed this morning by the Joint Chiefs." Elias took the frame, turned it over, and read the typed words. Then he handed it back. "Give it to the girl," he said, gesturing toward Ava. "She knew us before you did." That night, footage of the impromptu salute, the singing, and Elias's walk through the crowd went viral. It spread across military forums, social media timelines, and television news tickers. "Living legend silently honored at Veterans Day ceremony," one headline read. "I'm not here to be honored," says hero of 3 wars, "nation disagrees," read another. But Elias ignored them. He turned off his phone, unplugged his television, and made a pot of tea. He sat at his kitchen table, jacket still buttoned, medals still shining faintly in the dim kitchen light. He placed a single photograph on the table, the 761st, lined up in formation in a muddy field in France, faces weary, tank behind them. He stared at it for a long time. Then he whispered, "They saw us today." The following morning, the phone at the youth center rang off the hook. It had reopened temporarily in a new building, and dozens of parents and students called to ask if Sarge still taught there. Some brought printed articles, unsure if the man in the photographs was the same one who once patched up their science fair boards and fixed leaky faucets. The director, an older woman who remembered Elias's hammer always hanging from his belt, answered simply, "He's still around." 2 days later, a package arrived at Elias's apartment. No return address. Inside was a black velvet box. He opened it to find a replica of the Distinguished Service Cross. Beneath it, a card read, "To the man who carried more than we ever knew. From those who now know." He placed the medal in the drawer, beside the others. But the next time he went out, jacket buttoned, cane in hand, he added a new patch to his chest. Not the medal. Not an award. Just a small black panther, embroidered on a field of dark green. He didn't need words. Everyone knew now. 3 days after the ceremony, Elias Booker rose early. At 98, mornings came slowly, but this one arrived with a quiet purpose. He moved through his tiny apartment with care, dressing in his uniform for what might be the last time. Each crease, each medal, each button, placed as if it were a ritual. He didn't say much. Didn't need to. Some memories only answered to silence. At 9:12 a.m., a military vehicle from Fort Myer arrived. A young specialist stepped out and spotted Elias already waiting with his ivory-handled cane. "I've been walking these stairs for decades," Elias said with a nod, waving off help. "Let me do it once more." They drove in respectful quiet toward the National Mall. When they arrived, Elias took his time walking past the reflecting pool. The crowd was thinner now, the flags less vibrant, but the memorial stood unchanged, a ring of granite pillars bearing the names of states, flanked by fountains and history. His destination was a specific panel, etched with a brief but powerful tribute. They fought not only the enemy, but prejudice. There, at the southern arc of the World War II memorial, was the marker for the African American units. No names. No faces. Just an acknowledgement long overdue. Elias stood before it in silence. The past folded in around him. He could see them, Bennett with the crooked smile, Davis quoting scripture before every mission, Robinson scribbling poems between skirmishes. Most gone now. All left out of the parades they earned. From his coat pocket, Elias withdrew something small, his original bronze star. Not the polished replacement, but the scarred one, awarded in a muddy French field in 1944. With slow, reverent motion, he knelt and placed it beneath the plaque. "For my boys," he whispered. "All of them." A hush fell over the space. Tourists paused. A few veterans bowed their heads. Nearby, a young mother stopped her daughter from speaking. The girl, no more than 6, held something in her hand, a red paper poppy. She stepped forward, uncertain, then reached up to him. "My teacher said you're a hero," she said. Elias smiled faintly. He took the poppy and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "I just did what needed doing," he replied. He didn't linger. A staffer from the National Archives met him next, guiding him to a private room. On the table lay 2 thin manila folders. "It's not much," she apologized. "Some of the records were sealed or lost. But this is what we found." He nodded and opened the first. Inside were unit reports, grainy black and white photographs, a few personal letters. One image showed Elias, age 19, in a tank hatch, squinting at the light. Another showed the 761st lined up in formation, boots muddy, eyes steady. "These stories deserve a place," the staffer said. "Send copies to the youth center in Baltimore," Elias said. "Let the kids read them." She paused. "Sir, would you consider being part of an exhibit? Or maybe an oral history project?" He shook his head. "It was never just about me." By that evening, his story had reached further still. A university in Georgia requested a commencement address. A documentary team offered funding. Even the Army's social media page posted a tribute titled, "Panthers Never Sleep." But Elias made only one commitment, a visit to Fort Knox. It was there, in 1942, that he'd first trained for war. The base had changed, new buildings, newer tanks, but some things remained. The sharp scent of diesel. The rhythmic echo of boots. The flag catching the sun just right. Lieutenant Ava Reynolds met him at the entrance. "They've named a building after your battalion," she said. "Panther Hall." "They would have liked that," Elias replied. Inside, the walls bore stories long untold. Photos, maps, citations. In one corner stood a bust, not of Elias, but a composite, a faceless figure in tanker's gear, labeled 761st Tank Battalion, fought in silence. Remembered in song. New cadets walked past with quiet reverence. Some saluted. Some paused to read every word. One leaned in to whisper, "He's here. The real one." Outside, a drill formation was underway. The commander called for attention as Elias stepped onto the field. He turned, faced the recruits, and raised his hand in a crisp, deliberate salute. Every soldier there followed his lead. A cadet snapped a picture, Elias saluting the next generation. That night, back in Baltimore, Elias placed the poppy on his nightstand and opened a small wooden box. Inside were letters, medals, and a worn patch of the 761st Panther. He added a note on folded stationery. "Don't forget them." Then, quietly, he turned out the light. And the room, for once, felt full, not with words, but with all the voices history had finally begun to hear. We remember.